Okay, I know this video is called Andrew Jackson, but before we get into it, we got to kind of touch base on some other things. So after the War of 1812, like we talked about in class, Americans have a very strong sense of nationalism. All right, they love their country. They want to do things pro-America, go, yay, all that stuff. And James Monroe is also elected president. He's a Democratic Republican. This rise in the love of our country and all this stuff was known as the era of good feelings. And it kind of it's known as nationalism. When you love your country, you have pride in your country, nationalism. When you love an area or your state, it's called sectionalism. But this era of loving your country and being pro-United States all the time was called the era of good feelings, and this kind of came under James Monroe. So Monroe was kind of famous for issuing what eventually became known as the Monroe Doctrine. So he issued this statement, and it kind of declared these three things. America was closed to further colonization. Nobody could come here and colonize anymore. All right? Any European efforts to colonize in America would be seen as a threat or dangerous to our well-being as a country. So if Britain or Spain or France tried to do any more further colonizing of any territory in the Americas, we would consider it a threat and dangerous. And the third thing is that the U.S. in return would kind of stay out of all European affairs. It wouldn't bother any colonization or any colonies already set up. And so this showed that the U.S. saw itself as a world power. Hey, we're a world power. We're here. We can make this happen. That was a bold statement by James Monroe at the time, which just kind of glossed over. If we look back on it, it was a huge statement for him to make. So now let's kind of get going into the heart of this video. So we're going to talk about the rise of Jackson and the Democratic Party. So in the 1824 election, John Quincy Adams won the president, but Jackson won the popular vote. And it was kind of shady how the whole thing went down. It ended up being a tie. Nobody got electoral college, So John Quincy Adams once again voted on in the House, and people threw him support. And Jackson was kind of like, man, that's really unfair. I won the popular vote. So anyway, obviously, he kind of gained some momentum behind that. And all this tension that rose out of this kind of shady election kind of divided the Democratic Republicans. So Jefferson's party was kind of disbanding. And Jackson claimed to represent the common man, the simple man. All right, kind of the guys that Thomas Jefferson envisioned, the farmers, the workhorses, people like that. And that kind of representative claim of the common man grew into the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party. So in 1828, Jackson wanted to widen political power. He wanted more people to vote. He wanted more people to have more say in the government. And this idea was kind of known as majority rule. And the whole scope of Jackson's theory of more people in the government, more power to the people was known as Jacksonian democracy. And Jackson won the election based on this platform in 1828. So he eventually does become president, basically by saying that more people should vote. So we have a new political era. You have more public involvement in government, so more officials, more things like that. Voting expanded to all white males. It's no longer if you just own property. So any white male can vote. And you have a limited government, but a much stronger executive branch. So you see Andrew Jackson trying to gain some power here. And that's the beauty of checks and balances, because Andrew Jackson could have done a lot more things if it wasn't for the checks and balance systems we had in place. So Jackson practiced what is known as a spoil system when he became president. He basically gave everybody a job in the government that supported him and backed him during his campaign. And that's known as the spoil system. And it's still used today, and it was still used before. It just got a name under Jackson. So during Jackson's presidency, the country was being pulled apart by all these different conflicts. And all these conflicts and regions supported things. So you had the South, you had the Northeast, you had the West, and they all supported different aspects of the issues that came up. And one of the big issues was the idea of federal government versus state rights. Who had more power? Who should have the final say and all that stuff? So we'll talk about that a little bit in the Nullification Crisis. So tariffs or taxes were one of the big issues that divided the nation. All right, Northeast, Southern, and the western part of the country all were dealing with this issue of taxes. So Southerners hated this tariff or this tax placed on raw materials and manufactured goods because it hurt their economy. I mean, that's what they did. They gave raw materials. They gave manufactured goods. So this tariff was killing them. And Southerners felt that this economic interest of the Northeast was part of that U.S. plan. Or, let me rephrase that. So the Northeast, the Southerners felt the Northeast were directing national policy. So because the Northeast wanted these tariffs, the government gave them these tariffs. And the Southerners were like, hey, we don't want these tariffs. Why has nobody listened to our voice? So the Southerners, felt that the northeastern part of the state was pushing our national policy. And that's never a good thing if part of the country feels unloved. Okay, so South Carolina was hit hard by the tariff. They were struggling as it is. They're in kind of a mini depression in that state. And they were threatening to secede or leave the Union. They were like, this is so bad and it's hurting us so much that we got to leave. We got to get out. So John C. Calhoun, who was the vice president at this time under Andrew Jackson, and who was also from South Carolina, he introduced the idea of the doctrine of nullification. And this said that a state had the right to nullify or reject or reject a federal law that they considered unconstitutional. So, and that's what South Carolina was hoping they could do with this Tariff Act. So the doctrine was obviously debated for a long time because this definitely benefited certain states. Whoa! That could have been bad. Let me fix this for just a second here. Okay. So then, all those tariff things and all the issues that got handled in South Carolina, you know, they eventually do secede, but for different reasons. Those tariffs kind of got handled. They were able to nullify that doctrine. They nullified a couple other tariffs as well. So Jackson also wanted to remove all Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. He wanted them gone. He felt like this was our land and we should use it. So Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and that called for the government to negotiate treaties so that it would require Native Americans to move out past west of the Mississippi River. So in order for, you know, obviously not everybody supported this land or this act, but Jackson immediately started to enforce that law, and many Native Americans signed the treaties because white settlers and miners were already coming into their land anyway, so they were already taken over. So by signing a treaty, they traded their current land for land in Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Kansas. So it was kind of a flip-flop. So it was, a lot of Native Americans saw it as, you know, a lesser of two evils. We lose our land here, but hey, at least we can get some land out here. And obviously, you know, we know that it did not work out in their favor. So, but some of the Cherokee Native Americans decided to stand up for what they believed in, and they remained behind. And Andrew Jackson, he took it to them, unfortunately. So Jackson refused to negotiate with the Cherokees after this. After they chose to stay, they refused to negotiate, and he sent in federal troops and he rounded them up in a ton of camps. I mean, he just, you know, rounded everybody up that he could find, and he basically forced them to leave and walk all the way to that new Indian territory out in Oklahoma. And this eventually became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands and thousands of Native Americans died on the way. Some of them were forced to walk without taking any of their belongings, the clothes on their back, you know, lack of food, dehydration, and you know, all this was a terrible thing for a country to be a part of. And unfortunately, opening up that land and moving out those Native Americans, it gave Americans this kind of false sense of expansion, this false sense of manifest destiny, that maybe it was the belief where God had destined America to expand from coast to coast, because Jackson was pushing the Native Americans out. He was opening up this land, so Americans started to rally behind it. And you do get this idea of manifest destiny, and not all of it is bad. Not all the manifest destiny is bad, but how we got a lot of that land was not under some of the best terms. So people started to move west. And so that's where the next video and the rest of this kind of our history is going to take forth, is us expanding out all the way to the Pacific coast under this idea of manifest destiny. So that's Andrew Jackson and his presidency and everything that he did while he was president.